Hey guys, hope y'all are doing well. So we're going to start period two's review video. And just a little bit of a refresher from period one. So Spain and various European nations were essentially fighting for control of the Americas. Spain sought to establish tight control over the process of colonization in the Western Hemisphere and to convert and or exploit indigenous populations so they can expand into the New World. French and Dutch took a different approach. They had very few Europeans that actually, French and Dutch, that came to the New World, and therefore those few who did come established strong trade alliances and intermarriages with indigenous populations in order to acquire wealth. In Spain, it's gold, silver. In French and Dutch, it's really about furs and other exports to Europe. And now the English. That's what we're going to focus in on period two. Unlike the European competitors, the English eventually sought to establish colonies based on agriculture, sending relatively large numbers of men and women to acquire land and populate the settlements. Although the Spanish did send people to colonize, and there was some agriculture in the encomiendas and the plantations, the Spanish really are about gold and silver, as opposed to the English, which was really about agriculture. All right, so let's start with our first colony, English colony. It's called the Chesapeake Colony. And the Chesapeake Colony makes up Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland. The English are going to start to colonize because of the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. So we'll know that the English are starting to build up their navy and they're going to go on to dominate. And their first big victory that will gain English access to the Atlantic so that they can cross the Atlantic in order to colonize the Americas was the defeat of the Spanish Armada. At first, the English tried private ventures. These are individuals, noblemen who tried to find gold in the Americas, like Sir Francis Drake and the Roanoke colony, but those failed. So soon, the emerging merchants in England, these are the merchant class that is starting to grow wealthier and wealthier. And this class is going to pull their monies together into what is known as a joint stock company, and they're going to sponsor ventures to the New World. At first, of course, it was to attain wealth, so to find gold. But North America really didn't have a whole lot of gold, so it's going to convert to agriculture. So the company, one of the first or the first joint stock companies, is going to be the Virginia Company of London. And people who signed up to go were mostly males, and they will cross the Atlantic on board. There's 144 of them on board the Godspeed, Discovery, and the Susan Constant. But out of the 144 men who signed up, only about 110 survived the crossing. And so when they got to their location, which will become Jamestown, 1607, the first settlement by the English, we're going to see that they, of course, were crazy eyed looking for natives so that they could take them to the gold, but alas, there is no gold. So the Jamestown settlement actually didn't do very well at first. Um, but it will become profitable not because of gold, but because of tobacco, again, agriculture. Lord Delaware is going to arrive in Jamestown in 1610, and it wasn't doing really well. Remember, these were just a bunch of men who were crazy eyed looking for gold. Delaware is basically saying there is no gold, let's give it up, and instead let's work towards agriculture. So Delaware did something interesting that's going to establish what will become a political culture of capitalism. He is going to divide all the company's land among the surviving colonists, and land ownership becomes this incentive now in order to produce agriculture because anything in and above their quota will be kept personally. So you can become wealthy individually. Uh, Piggybacking off of the success of Virginia is going to be John Rolfe, who will then take the product that we're producing, tobacco, and make it better. He's going to hybridize using, of course, Native American knowledge. He's going to hybridize tobacco, making it much more disease resistant, and that means that there will be more tobacco to be produced. The issue about tobacco, though, is that it's a high labor product and it quickly exhausts the land. So we're going to start to see expansion further into the interior, encroaching on native spaces, but also a need for high labor. So the English are going to incentivize English to come to the New World. There's going to be a series of things that the English government will do that will encourage migration. So the price revolution and the enclosure wars. Um, so the price revolution. So what happened here? Well, when the Spanish, back in time, back during the 1500s, when the Spanish flooded the European markets with the gold and silver that they acquired in South America, this is going to lead to, of course, inflation, which is going to increase prices. And so we're starting to see a price revolution take place. And benefiting from this price revolution are going to be those merchants that are going to increasingly obtain wealth and therefore power in the House of Commons. And so it's these merchants that are going to form the joint stock companies. So these merchants who are now in the House of Commons are going to pass laws that benefit themselves, and one of them is the enclosure laws. And this was passed to encourage sheep grazing to fuel the emerging textile industry in England. And this is going to displace a lot of agricultural workers who will seek opportunities as indentured servants in the New World. So, indentured servitudes, this was basically incentive to come to the New World. A landowner in the New World, in the Americas, is going to sponsor your voyage, pay for your trip across the Atlantic, and in exchange, you're going to devote 5 to 7 years of service to that landowner. And this was how most English came to the New World in the early to mid 1600s. Unfortunately, only 1 in 10 outlived their indentured contracts, but if they did, they got some land in the interior of the settlement, so closer to indigenous populations. All right, and all of this population growth is going to lead to conflict with natives. And we're going to talk about the major conflict with natives in the Chesapeake in a second. Population growth is also going to create a need to organize. And one way to organize the settlement was to divide these villages and towns into what are known as burghs, right? So we're going to see that this political organization is the foundations of government in the New World. All right, so we are going to create self-governing institutions, and it's going to be broken up into burghs, and each burgh is going to elect a representative to attend an assembly that would make laws for the colony. This is known as the Virginia House of Burgesses, and so this is the first representative colonial legislature in American history. And so, again, we're going to start to see in terms of expansion, yes, the creation of self-governing institutions, but also more encouragement by joint stock companies to migrate for English to migrate to the New World. So, in addition to the indentured servitude system, there's also the headright system, and the joint stock company would essentially give any landowner 50 additional acres for each person who they sponsored passage for across the Atlantic. And so all this population growth, right, due to the indentured servitude, the headright system, is going to lead to conflict with natives. The conflict that I'll have you know for the Chesapeake, right, is the Powhatan Confederacy and the Powhatan Uprising. Um, and so the Powhatans, they were dominant in this territory of the Chesapeake, um, but they were a confederacy. So they were actually made up of a lot of different tribes, smaller tribes along the James River. And together, when they saw the encroachment by English settlers, they decided to form a confederacy in order to deal with the various encroachments. And as you can see, in purple is the Powhatan Confederacy, made up of all those different tribes. All right, and this is in the Virginia territory, and it's right here, the Powhatan tribes. All right. So the Powhatans are going to react. They're going to rebel against the Virginians, these Chesapeake colonists, and the result is warfare. And the problem with this is that during this intense year of fighting, no one tended to the crops, and so not only did the Virginia Joint Stock Company not see profit that year, but there's also no food. So starvation was a big issue associated with the Powhatan uprising. So as a result, Virginia Company does go bankrupt and Chesapeake becomes a royal colony. When it becomes a royal colony, they're subject now to English law. And one of the things that we'll see is under English law is chattel slavery, which means that slaves were property, not just people, they were property. And slavery is an inherited situation. So once you have children, those children become slaves. This was actually different. Um, than what slavery looked like in Jamestown prior to 1624 when the Virginia Company goes bankrupt. Prior to that, the first slave ship arrives in 1619, and essentially they were treated as indentured servants. But by 1624, now chattel slavery is in place, and so we'll start to see slaves being used in perpetuity. The second thing that we're going to see as a result of Virginia Company going bankrupt and Chesapeake becoming a royal colony was the Anglicanization of the colony. So now they're going to have tax supported churches, just like they do in England. So if you live in the area in Chesapeake, your tax dollars will go to the one Anglican church in the Chesapeake. Uh, so that I lay the foundation of that because that's going to turn out to be a problem. Okay, so here's another conflict. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. So as the Chesapeake, Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland start to increase in population, and as more and more indentured servants survive their servitude and take land that is infringing upon native territory, we're going to see the natives are retaliating, like we saw in the Powhatan Confederacy uprising. And there's going to be an event known as Bacon's Rebellion, in which a group of farmers, these are former indentured servants, basically in the back country of Virginia, right, further away from the coast. That's where the land of the former indentures went, and these backcountry folk were being attacked by native tribes. So they appealed to their government. Um, the governor of Virginia, a guy named William Berkeley. And so they said, "Hey, Berkeley, we really need protection from attacking natives." And Berkeley, who had actually had a good relationship with the natives, that's how he got his fur trade up and running, said, "Nah, we're not gonna attack the natives because I have a good deal going with the natives." So this is going to lead to an uprising of farmers, pitchfork wielding farmers, led by Nathaniel Bacon, and they're going to go to Jamestown and basically burn it down. So this is going to be again the elite Tidewater versus the backcountry simple common man. All right. So Bacon's army will attack Jamestown, burn it down in 1676. And as a result, many of the elite plantation owners of the Chesapeake are going to say, indentured servants are a pain. So let's instead go with African slaves. Because of chattel slavery, we don't ever have to give these slaves land and they will not be a problem for us. So we're starting to see a shift more towards the African labor movement. All right, Maryland. So one of the things that's going to happen is that as we see more and more migrations to of English to North America, we're going to start to see some diversity taking place. For example, in Maryland, it was established as a proprietary colony. This is owned by an individual, given by the king to an individual. And in this case, it was Lord Baltimore. And he is going to use his colony as a haven for persecuted Catholics. And so Maryland will be established, Mary's land. And the economy will be very similar to that of Virginia: tobacco, plantation, slavery, all of that. And Uh, we're going to also see that Maryland will also see an increase in population, but most of the people that are going to come to Maryland aren't necessarily going to be Catholics. They're going to be Protestants, and so there's going to be a conflict in this area between the Catholics who were largely uh, landowners, rich landowners, and friends of Lord Baltimore, and then your average common Joe Protestant who are coming here for the same reasons they're coming into the Virginia colony. And so the powers that be, right, in Maryland, in the Maryland General Assembly, they're going to pass a law called the Maryland Toleration Act. And that basically said that as long as you're Christian, we will all tolerate each other. But the point being is that we're starting to see religious diversity, diversity in general within the colonies. All right. So let's go to oop, to slavery because we're starting to see an increase in slavery. And as you can see here, um, what's essentially going to happen is the triangular trade. So Europe is going to send rum over here to Africa, who will then exchange it for slaves, who will then move the slaves over here to produce sugar, who will then move the sugar to Europe, which will turn into rum, and then we have this triangular thing going. All right, so the African slave trade. This was actually initiated by the Portuguese in the 1600s. Um, then the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the English will get involved in the African slave trade. So by the late 1600s, there's going to be uh, a big event in the African slave trade. The Royal African Company had a monopoly over the slave trade, but that monopoly will break, prices for slaves will fall, and the result is going to be an increased number of slaves going into the New World. Most captured Africans were taken to the colonies in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, but we're going to see only a small percentage going directly to North America. Um, that's going to change with time, but just know that the British did end the slave trade in 1807 and outlawed slavery in 1833. It's not going to be the United States will continue the use of slavery until 1865. All right, so part of that triangular trade, one of the legs of that triangular trade was the Middle Passage. And this was horrifying because this is taking Africans from Africa in horrible conditions to the Americas. And one of the contributing factors of the outlawing of slavery by the British is going to be exposure of what the Middle Passage looked like. Um, Alundwe Ikoyano wrote a book about his life as a slave, and he described the Middle Passage and the horrors of the Middle Passage. And this, of course, is going to bring about awareness of the situation. And it will take a while, but the British will eventually outlaw slavery after the publication of the interesting narrative of the life of Alduanu Ikoyano. All right. So slavery was going to be a significant part of the Southern colonies. So I'm going to shift from Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland that are considered part of the Chesapeake colonies to what is considered the Southern colonies of South Carolina and Georgia. So slavery was also significant. Now, there's going to be slavery in the Chesapeake, but there's also going to be slavery in the Southern colonies due to this emerging plantation system. All right, so there's a British colony in the Atlantic right here. Where is it? Barbados. There it is. Right here, a little Caribbean island called Barbados. And it was a sugar producing island, and it was very, very profitable. And as a result, we're going to see that many of the British landowners in Barbados are going to appeal to the king, and they're going to get a proprietary colony here in the Carolinas. This was largely as a result of what are known as the Restoration colonies, and this was where, and we'll talk about this later, but the restoration of the monarchy, and the king is going to reward his supporters by giving them proprietary colonies in the New World. And one of those proprietary colonies were 8 proprietors that are going to create the Carolinas. Now, they mimicked the culture and the plantation systems of Barbados, and they'll attempt and they will do some sugar cultivation there. But eventually, the Carolinas are going to be known as rice growing plantations in South Carolina. The Caribbean and Brazil remain sugar economies, and Virginia and Maryland tobacco economies. All right, and as we go into the late 1600s, again, the use of African slaves. What about slavery in New England? So slavery is going to be traded in New England, but very few traders or merchants actually owned slaves, other than maybe one or two for domestic reasons. We don't see that same type of plantation economy in New England that we see in the Southern and Chesapeake colonies. All right, so all of this acquisition of territory is going to lead to warfare amongst the European nations who are trying to colonize the North America. So the English-Spanish Wars are known as the Anglo-Spanish Wars, leads to the creation of Georgia. So the Spanish, here's a map so you can kind of see it. So we've been colonizing South Carolina, very profitable right here. And because of its profitability, the Spanish who are here in Florida kept attacking the Carolinas, trying to upset the economy there because, again, the Spanish are trying to dominate the Americas, much like the English are now trying to dominate the Americas. So the Spanish conducted border raids, and they include a lot of the native populations. The Spanish also kind of coaxed the indigenous populations to attack the Carolinas as well. So the king decided, in order to protect South Carolina, let's create a buffer colony called Georgia. And so Georgia was created as a southern colony, not only as a defensive buffer, but to rid England's overcrowded jails of debtors. All right, so the slave population is going to increase, and we're going to see some conflict and rebellion associated with slaves. Some of the rebellion is overt, some of the rebellion is covert. Overt would be physical resistance, it would be runaway, but covert would be slowdowns, sabotage, that kind of thing. So, an example of rebellion by the slaves, let's go to South Carolina again. So, the Stono County Rebellion, it happened in 1739, where 20 African slaves in the Carolinas met at the Stono River, approximately 20 miles southwest of Charleston, which was a major port in the Carolinas. And they took guns and gunpowder from a store and killed 2 of the storekeepers. And then they started heading towards Spanish Florida. And as they uh, marched down to Florida, they're going to acquire more and more and more people to join their band of revelers. And so we'll see that slave owners will catch up with them, and the the result will be execution and further suppression of any type of slave rebellion. So the slave revolts would lead plantation owners to intensify slave codes, which resulted in the movement of slaves, which restricted the movement of slaves. And an example of that is the Virginia Slave Codes of 1660s. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is the slave culture. So, because there were so many slaves on the plantation, this essentially formed small communities. And these communities did things to protect their dignity, to protect their culture. So, there are a lot of characteristics of slave culture, and that slave culture will emerge. Some of those characteristics included extended kinship networks, because children were often torn away from parents. Largely, children were raised by the community or surrogate relatives because obviously families were ripped apart. Another is language because many Africans came from different parts of Africa, so they spoke different languages. They developed a universal language on a plantation. For example, in South Carolina, it was Gula. It was a hybrid English and African language so that they can communicate with each other, even in secret against the overseer or the plantation owner. Another ritual was jumping the broom, which was essentially a wedding ceremony. Religiously, plantation owners often required their slaves to convert to Christianity. So what emerged was a hybrid religion known as Santeria and Voodoo. All right, so that ends uh, our part one of period two. See you guys later.